Today, to finish out this Intro to Ethics little three-part series, we've covered rights-based ethics, or libertarianism. We've covered duty-based ethics, which is utilitarianism. And now we're moving on to duty-based ethics. Now, duty-based ethics has a lot of appeals that other ethical systems don't. And I think it's important to note that oftentimes, ethics is more about giving argumentation to things that we already believe rather than making us change our minds. And in a sense, this is intuitive because it's hard to change your primal ethical impulses to save someone who's drowning. You know, there are certainly ethical situations you could come up with for like a utilitarian or something to say that there are situations where saving someone who's drowning is the wrong thing. Like maybe, I don't know, should you save Hitler if he's drowning? Duty-based ethics is going to be better in certain ways because in some senses it gets rid of the gray area, and in others it brings it back. Me personally, duty-based ethics is probably my least favorite for a number of meta-ethical reasons, but I'm going to try to keep my biases at ease here and just give you as clear of an understanding of duty-based ethics as I can. Now, we're going to be looking at the deontological ethics of Immanuel Kant, and we're going to be looking at the virtue ethics of Aristotle. We're going to be comparing these in certain ways, seeing what their underlying maxims are, and see how they change the way that we look at ethical problems. Now, if we want to do that, we have to cover a few terms, and this first one, I don't think really has much, freedom. Freedom is generally considered not being impeded by external things. I am free to make a decision if someone is not holding a gun to my head and making me do this. Now, an important thing to say right from the start is that especially for Kant's ethics, Kant is focused on freedom. Rights-based ethics is similar to this. It's focusing on the liberty of the individual to do as he or she pleases, provided that it does not violate other people's rights. And by agreeing that there are certain bounds that everyone cannot cross, of which rights are created from, we are able to function in a society where personal liberty is the most valued. Kant is similar to this because Kant recognizes people differ on a lot of different things that they do in their lives, partially because they have different ends to which they are driving towards. A lot of people have a problem with utilitarianism, which is basically going to say greatest good for the greatest number. That we are aimed at maximizing human well-being and minimizing human suffering. And as such, this is generally going to be our maxim. That if we have two choices to decide between, we're going to find a way to quantify how does each one impact human well-being and suffering, or human pleasure and suffering, whatever you want to use. It's important to note that that idea of pleasure, though, is not sexual pleasure. It's more like jouissance in French. It's desire, well-being, enjoyment, whatever it may be. And after we do this kind of cost-benefit analysis between the two decisions, we can say, okay, we're all humans, and we all, kind of like Hobbes says, we're all fighting for our desires, and we're all fighting for our own pleasure. And if we're aware of that, we can figure this into our decisions to say, okay, we all have human well-being in mind. And we should, because just like Hobbes says, without these rules in place, we're just in a state of nature where there's war and chaos, and no one has any like Geneva Conventions of what they can or can't do. And with this, we say, okay, we're all humans. We all ultimately are going to have this goal in mind to maximize human well-being and minimize human suffering, because by doing that for other people, it makes life better for me. Maybe that's selfish. Kant's point is that utilitarianism is a little bit dicey, because instead of focusing on freedom of action or on actions that everyone ought to do because they're good in themselves, they're doing them because it is a self-serving sort of, it's based on a goal. Kant is trying to say, okay, you want to do such and such action because it is profitable, or you want to do such and such action because it makes you look good, or you want to do some action, maybe even if it's like giving to charity, but you do it because it makes you feel good inside. Kant would say, this is not doing a good action because it's a good action. It's doing a good action as a means to some end, as a means to get money, social status, personal pleasure, whatever it may be. And Kant says, this is not really being a good person. Kant might say, you paying your taxes, that doesn't make you a good person, because usually when we pay our taxes, we don't pay it because society deserves my money. Oh my gosh, please take my money and deliver it as needed. No, you do it because you don't want to suffer the consequences. If you do see some silver lining to it as helping society, you only see it as such because it's going to come back and help you, make your roads all nice and pretty, and make new libraries and stuff like that. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but Kant thinks this is a bad way of looking at ethics, because you're not doing an action which is good in and of itself. You are doing an action that is good in relation to some end. So you are treating ethics as a means to an end. And Kant says we should do actions because they are good in and of themselves. For Kant, the best way to go about that is to come from a place of freedom. And this is an important thing about Kant, which makes him a little dicey for me, is it presupposes that we have free will. Kant says, look, you've got all these things around you telling you what you should do, and maybe you should sell the items in your butcher shop at such and such amount of money, but maybe you are solely doing it because it's profitable and not because it's actually a good price. You're selling this item at a particular price because it's profitable, not just because it's a good price in and of itself. And Kant thinks if we want to figure out what the good action is to do, we have to think about what we can apprehend through reason alone. And this is an important thing about Kant that's very admirable, is Kant was a deeply religious, he was a Christian philosopher, deeply. And in his philosophy, Kant focuses a lot on the ability of reason to come to true statements about the world, as little or as many as they may be. And Kant does not invoke God to come to his ethics. He says, God has given us these mental capacities, and if God has endowed us with this moral consciousness, we should be able to figure out what the right thing is to do through the reason given to us by God alone. It's kind of similar to how Descartes is trying to come to true statements about metaphysics using reason to come to a proof of God. And in this sense, it's definitely a step up from some philosophers who might have seen this as a heresy of some kind. But Kant says, if we want to figure out what the best actions are to do, we shouldn't do them as a means to an end. We should do them because they are good in and of themselves. And we're going to be able to find this out through reason. And maybe I should. Kant says, I shouldn't do something because it's good for such and such end. Maybe the thing is you can donate to charity because you're a rich person and it makes you look good and feel good to donate to charity and show it to people. Kant would say that is not being a good person. Kant would in fact say that's being selfish. That's treating the well-being of other humans as a means to an end, namely your self-satisfaction or your self-image. Now maybe the question is, or maybe the alternative is, oh, you donate to charity, but just don't tell anyone about it. Don't boast about it. And then it will be the good action. Well, Kant says, oh, maybe still not, because you would be donating to charity because you think, or because it makes you feel good. So you're treating people as a means to your self-satisfaction. Kant says if you're going to donate to charity, you shouldn't do it because it's a moment of growth for you, because it makes you look good, because it's a profitable business decision for part of your business's earnings to go toward some cause. Kant thinks you should donate to charity because it is a good action in and of itself, regardless of how you feel about it. Now, this is a little bit debatable because much of the reason that many people donate to charity is because, yes, it helps other people, but this also brings one a sense of joy and satisfaction in one's action. And Kant would see this as a very negative thing, as a form of self-servingness. But we could easily as well intuit that maybe this is what should accompany good actions. You should have the right to feel satisfied and feel personally fulfilled. And maybe this in fact should guide your actions. Because if you do a good action and you also happen to feel good about it, what's wrong with that? Well, Kant might say, what if killing people also makes you feel good? Then you're doing a bad action and it makes you feel good. So Kant says, okay, your personal feelings about it, that this is treating the action as a means to an end, and clearly there's something else other than these ends that makes an action good. So Kant says, if we want to make a good action, we should treat people as ends in themselves, not a means to an end. So if we want to donate to charity, we should do it solely because of these people's value as a human being. The satisfaction that you get from this, I'm not really sure if Kant would say you shouldn't get that satisfaction. I think he would probably just say that that satisfaction should not be relevant in your ethical decision. You should do something because it treats people as an end in themselves and not as a means to some end. Maybe this is Iraq in late 1980s, 1990, 1991. And there's discovered to be a lot of oil in Iraq. And a certain someone by the name of Dick Cheney especially, but others as well, say, you know what would be great? If we made up that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And why should we do this? So that we can invade Iraq and seem like we're fighting a war on terror and get some oil in the process. Allow us some places to have these offshore drilling rigs and all this stuff and get us some money. Kant would say, no, because that is treating the well-being of the citizens involved in the Gulf War, the public perception of all of this. Everything in here is treated as a means to an end, namely the end of money, or the end of national security, or the end of the optics of the war on terror. Kant would say this should be treated as an end in and of itself. Is it the right thing to do to plant fake evidence and invade a foreign sovereign nation? That's a whole, in that particular example, there's lots we could go into. But the point is that Kant thinks that if we're trying to justify this action, we shouldn't justify it because of money or optics or national security interests. The question should be the rationality or the reason basis of the action itself. Is it a right action to invade a sovereign nation? And that brings us on to the second thing, which you might hear pretty commonly from an elder of some kind who is reprimanding you for something. What if everybody did that? Kant says, okay, we could look at these ethical decisions in the abstract, and we can come up with moral laws. And Kant says you should only act such that you could, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but something akin to, you should only act on that which you could will to be a eternal moral law. If you could wish everybody to have done that. So for Kant, we should base our ethics off of ethical principles that we come up with in abstract, through reason alone. And that way, we are not treating our ethical principles based off of our experience or based off of the things that serve us best, but rather seeing what is a good action in and of itself. And a little thing that Kant does is he says, okay, what if everyone did that? What if everyone invaded sovereign nations because they wanted oil? And I literally want you to think, what if every single nation was actively invading every single other nation at the same time to try to get natural resources of some kind? It would be complete chaos, and that's kind of already what's happening. But if literally every single place was doing this, society would collapse. If every single society was this offensive, we wouldn't even be able to function. We'd be back in Hobbes' state of nature. So he says, we can know that this concept is wrong in the abstract because it would be contradictory if we made it a moral law that all had to follow. If Dick Cheney said, I will it to be an eternal moral law that anyone may, for their own self-interests and for the purposes of profit, invade a sovereign nation in order to gain natural resources. You couldn't make this a moral law because everyone couldn't follow it and still be alive. So Kant says, if everybody did this and it turned into craziness, it literally would contradict itself because no one would be able to follow it. That's how we know it is wrong in the abstract. So Kant uses this idea of freedom to say, okay, I can step back from the universe, I can detach myself from the universe, and I can come up with things that are good in the abstract because they don't do things as a means to some kind of end, but they do things because they are good in and of themselves, and also because I know I could will it to be an eternal moral law for everyone, and we could all follow it. So Kant would say, let's take dressing some kind of way, and this is one of the things that really brings out a lot of the problems with duty ethics, is what if everyone went around nude? The question would be, what if everyone was around nude? Kant would say, what if everyone went around nude? Here is where he would say, well, we couldn't function as society. It would just be utter chaos, just like invading other countries. And the question starts to become, have we really been able to detach ourselves from the universe? And is this even something we should want to do? To take away our personal sentiments? Because it certainly is the case that many of our ethical judgments are in fact virtue judgments about what we find to be virtuous and correct. And it might be the case that in a society with the current mindset, it would very well be impossible to have a society where everyone runs around nude. So it seems that then we've inserted an end, namely the current society that we're in, as the basis for judging this action. So Kant would say, no, we can't let anyone go around nude, because if everyone was nude, it would be chaos. And the question we can ask is, would it? How do we know? It seems like we're basing this off of some assumptions, and maybe they're good or bad assumptions. But it starts to get a little gray here when we consider, can we really abstract ourselves like this from the universe? And you could take this to varying degrees and say, what if people went around with no shirt? This seems a little less extreme, you know? I mean, at beaches, guys go around with no shirt, and women go around with a bikini. And the question is, well, you know, there's no problem with guys running around without a shirt, and there is a problem with women running around with no shirt. And the question is, why is that? And we could very well say that while we would like to pretend that our personal feelings about what is acceptable, what we could make an eternal moral law and make everyone follow it, we start to realize if we're actually able to take ourselves away from the universe like that and abstract ourselves, or if in fact the reason why we have certain ethical impulses is actually a lot more to do with tradition. Things that have been traditionally considered virtuous, or things that have been traditionally valued. And even today, I mean, if I took my shirt off right now, you might be a little alarmed, but it probably wouldn't get me taken down off YouTube. It would probably get some kind of restriction put on the video, maybe, you know, it would be 18 and up. But if I was a woman and I took off my shirt and I had no bra on, the video would get taken down. And one might appeal to biology and say, well, you know, breasts they're a private part, whereas the male chest is not, because there's no breast. Well, the question is this idea of like your private parts, is this not just an appeal to what we find comfortable? Is it really impossible to imagine a world where people could go on the beach and women could have their shirts off with no bikini top or whatever? Maybe you just think I'm a creep. I think that serves my point exactly, because at some point we recourse in these extreme things to, well, no, everybody couldn't do that. It would be chaos. It would be too much. And at this point, this ethical system starts to become a question of personal incredulity. There are some situations where it does seem like, for example, invading sovereign nations for money. We can look at that in the abstract and say, okay, if everyone did that, our societies would literally collapse. But there are others, and often most of our ethical judgments are not these extreme cases. They are very typical cases. I mean, should someone who just got in a car wreck and their phone falls out of their pocket, should someone be allowed to take that phone if the person died in the car wreck? It's like, whoa, 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 what is that? That was an actual article we had in class that we applied this system to. But oftentimes, these decisions are right here. They're not invading sovereign nation questions, although they can be. Often they're these rather benign things. And the question is there a gray area here or is there not? Now, Aristotle's virtue ethics are a little different, and virtue ethics has actually had a comeback recently. At one time it was not as in fashion, but with people like Alistair MacIntyre, for example, it has come back into favor a little bit. And some important stuff for talking about Aristotle's ethics is we have to understand what is a telos. Because for Aristotle, ethics, talking about what is the right thing to do, requires thinking about what is the proper end of something. What is the telos, or purpose, goal, end? What is the telos of such and such thing? You may have heard the word telos from teleology, which is the study of the purpose, goal, or end of the universe. Typically this is in theology, and teleology is the study of kind of the timeline of Christianity, the end times, how does the Bible say that history is going to play out? That's teleology. It's basically a formalized, purpose-driven form of historiography. And Aristotle says, okay, if I want to figure out what is the proper thing that I should do with this Expo eraser, I need to think about the telos of the eraser. What is the purpose of the eraser? What is the end towards which it will naturally be driven? And as such, Aristotle thinks that we can use this in order to create a better society. And for Aristotle, the good society, that is what ethics is driven towards. It is creating the good society where people act in a good manner. Laws are created to help establish good habits and instill good character. So it's interesting to note that within this same kind of duty-based framework, Kant is a lot more open. And maybe kind of there is a gradient from libertarianism to deontology, which is Kant's ethics, to virtue ethics. And this is free to least free. For a libertarian, the only thing that is guiding your actions is a stopping point. For a libertarian, I can do anything I want in this room. I can take my shirt off, I can sing, I can whistle, I can do everything except something which is going to violate a right. I can't break this board because that violates someone's property right. Someone owns this and it's not me. I can't punch a hole in the wall. My room is on the other side of this wall and someone has actually punched a hole in the wall while I was sleeping and I woke up to it. That person cannot do that because it violates the property rights of the dorm building I live in. I cannot start recording things that are direct incitements to violence because this goes beyond the point of free speech into violent calls for action, which are not protected as forms of free speech. I also can't defame people through false allegations, because that's not protected by free speech either, because it harms someone's reputation, especially if they're a public person. So for a libertarian, ethics is more of a free, open state with a cutoff. And after that cutoff, you can't do what you want. But before that, you can do literally whatever you want. And there are different forms of libertarianism. I mean, you've got anarcho-libertarians who say, down with the state, it's a form of suppression of our ability to act as we would like. They levy taxes on us. They make it where we can't build what we want without permits. They make it where it's difficult to say exactly what we want because media is owned by the state or whatever. And certainly this is more the case in places where the media is owned by the state. But libertarians are generally going to be free. Then you've got Deontology, Kant's duty-based ethics, where I should be free to do what I want, provided that it is what I ought to do irrespective of some ends. So for example, Kant would say that even in the privacy of this room, I shouldn't strip here because this is a public space. Even if no one is here, it violates the rules for what one ought to do in a public space. Someone could come up. Even if they don't, the idea is that I'm violating a rule and potentially harming society. Even if that harm doesn't actually come, I violated a rule. And what if everyone did that? If everyone did that, then we would be violating this rule, and Kant would say everything would just go downhill from there. Then you've got virtue ethics. And virtue ethics is not nearly as free, because you have the libertarian where I can do everything and I want in this room as long as it's not violating some kind of property right or speech right or something like that. Deontology is like, I can do whatever I want as long as everyone could do it, as long as it's a law for everyone, and that makes things a little bit more restricted. But for virtue ethics, the only thing that I should be doing is that which promotes good character and is a good habit. Even if it is not necessarily violating a law that I have put on everyone like Kant, I should only be doing something in a similar sense if I could wish all of society to do it, because ultimately I'm one member of the society, and the government's job is to help facilitate a blanket of virtue around everyone. And in this sense, Aristotle's ethics is a little bit more totalizing. And maybe this is what you want. Maybe you think, as is often the case in the US, for example, you think, I'm for freedom, 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 freedom. But you see someone in a revealing outfit and you're like, no. That is not a virtuous thing for you to do with your body. Sure, you have the freedom to do that, but you still shouldn't do it. The question is, well, why shouldn't you do it? And we could come to some sort of Aristotelian virtue ethics of some kind, or Alistair McIntyre's virtue ethics, which I won't be talking about here. And you could appeal to that, and you could say, okay, well, freedom is important, but within that, maybe we're not actually for complete freedom. We're in favor of freedom within these bounds of what is within good character. Maybe this might be an interesting thing to talk about burning the American flag. Burning the American flag is protected as a form of free speech. Freedom of expression of your political views, you're not directly harming anyone by it, and that's a pretty libertarian way of looking at things. A virtue ethicist might say, no, if we want to live in a good society, we have to promote a society of good habits. And if everyone starts burning the flag, we're going to lose our sense of patriotism. And our society is going to fall out of virtuous behavior because it is virtuous to care for your country or whatever. So Aristotle's going to appeal to something like this. And he's going to say, okay, well, what is the purpose of the American flag? And you could say, okay, the purpose of the American flag is to show a sense of patriotism. And as such, actions that violate that are going against what one ought to do. Now, if we really want to get a handle on this a little more, we have to look at Aristotle's four causes. Aristotle thinks, okay, if you want to figure out what something is, there are four causes that cause that thing to be. And all of these things have to be satisfied, such for us to say that something is real or is. We've got our material cause. In the case of the marker, to go back to the eraser, the material cause is the material stuff it's made out of. So this is, I don't know, let's just say foam and whatever the bushy stuff is that actually does the erasing. The formal cause is the plan. It's kind of the schematic of this thing specifically. So it's going to take up such and such amount of space. It's going to be shaped in such a way. The scale of one side to the other is going to be such and such a way. Such that if I had another marker or another eraser exactly like it next to it, I could say these have the same formal cause. They respect the same formal plan of how they're created. So we could call this the plan. Now we've got the sufficient cause. Think of this as the sufficient condition that allows this thing to exist, namely the maker. So whoever manufactured this, whether it's a specific person or whether it's a company, that's a whole other thing, whether or not companies are people or corporations are people. But the sufficient cause is the maker of the thing. Now the final cause is what we are most interested in. This is the telos, the end towards which this is created. Now at first, telos of an item seems like a very concrete thing. The Expo eraser is good at erasing. This is what it was made for. And as such, if I want to use this the right way, because it seems intuitive to say, okay, there are right and wrong ways to use things. And a right way is going to be closely parallel with what it's best used for, what it can facilitate. So this can erase things, so that's what it should be used for. Now the question can be raised. There are a number of different uses for this, and it becomes a little tricky to talk about how we actually quantify what is the best use for something, but of course I got this Expo eraser from somewhere, and it was sold to me through a store that I went and bought it at, a Walgreens. So for Walgreens, the reason or the telos of this Expo eraser is for sale, for money. The reason for the existence of this eraser for Walgreens is to sell it. Now the question could be raised, ought one sell something? Is the purpose of this thing's existence to be sold? Maybe in a sense, but maybe not in another sense. It becomes rather confusing. What is the genuine use for something? Because something can have many different uses, and it can suit that use fairly well. You might ask about money. What is the purpose of money? Well, you might say it's for exchanging value between different persons. What about using money for firewood, for fodder for your fire? You might say, well, it's not very good at that, but what about if the currency is really inflated, like the Reichsmark in the Weimar Republic? That currency was so inflated, it cost several billion Reichsmarks to buy bread. It was genuinely more useful, and it could be genuinely seen as the purpose of that money in that time to be used as fire fodder. It was better to burn this currency than it was to accrue it and use it to buy things, because the thing that could be bought with that wouldn't serve as much use as warming yourself by burning it. So it suddenly seems like the telos, the purpose or the goal towards which something is driven, is actually not so timeless like we would like to think. It may have been that certain currencies at certain times, their purpose was to be exchanged, and other times their purpose was to be burned. And the same thing with the expo. Maybe now that we're in a society where capitalism is so central, maybe its purpose is genuinely more to be sold than it is to erase. Maybe it serves society more to sell the item and exchange it than does the use of erasing that it can also be used for. And the same thing with the American flag. What ought the American flag be used for? And we said earlier, well, it's used to show a sense of patriotism. Could it not also be the case that it is useful for burning? And maybe the impact of the way this is used, maybe that impact of being used as a patriotic symbol is equally as strong as burning it and using it for the purpose of being burned. It becomes very clear whether or not we can actually talk about the purpose that something ought to be used for with great certainty. What about a Stradivarius violin? I know that's not a very good drawing of a violin, but what about a Stradivarius violin? We could say, well, a violin is used for playing, especially something that's this expensive. It's been touched by the greatest luthiers of all time. Of course it should be used for playing. But let's say one of these Stradivarius violins is up for auction, and it so happens that there is Hilary Hahn there. Hilary Hahn is a great, well-known violinist. And there's also someone who is extremely, extremely rich. And Hilary Hahn gets outbid for the Stradivarius violin by this rich guy. And this rich guy decides that he wants to put the Stradivarius violin in a glass case and have it on display in his mansion. Now there's a part of this that unsettles us. This seems like we're using it for the wrong thing. It should be put to good use. It shouldn't be used for being looked at or for being a piece of history. Maybe this is the way it should be used, but maybe it's not. It is extremely hard to figure out how do we actually quantify this outside of simply our historical situation, our context that tells us how we do in fact use things, and thus tells us how we ought to use things. What the telos of something is in fact actually deeply embedded in history and in context. And as such, Aristotle says that we should be using things for their telos, their final cause. If we want to look at something, we look at it, its isness, we look at the material it's made out of, the plan that it follows, who made it, and what its final purpose is, and we look at all this stuff and we say, okay, it was created for this final purpose in mind, and we should be using it for that purpose. If we're not, we are failing to use things as they should be used. We are failing to cultivate good habits and create a society where we use things as they ought to be used. Maybe this is treating humans how they ought to be treated. And this will bring in, is there a maker of humans? Like, is there a God? Is this maker simply an evolutionary process? How does this influence what humans' purpose are? And there's a critical little thing in here that I think should be noted, which is that when we look about it like this, and we look at what is the purpose of the American flag or a Stradivarius violin. There is a subtle equivocation between what something was made for and what it ought to be for. When I talked about this eraser, we think of it was made for erasing in mind. But the question is, just because it was made with that in mind, does that mean that is what it ought to be used for? Maybe even if you do believe in God, let's say that the maker of humans is nature, evolutionary processes that result in the people that we are today, with our various genotypes and our behaviors and all of this stuff. And as such, we are made for survival. We are made for peaceful cooperation as a way to carry on our genes. The question is, just because this is what we are good at, or what evolution has made us for, because evolution is not conscious, it doesn't consciously decide what it makes, things that result from evolution are going to be oriented towards their survival. The question is, just because humans are good at that, does that mean that that is how humans ought to act? That they ought to solely act in their self-interests and only develop relationships insofar as it allows them to reproduce? It certainly is not intuitively the case that this is how we treat other people. And this is where we realize that ethics is in fact a question of examining the ways that we do act and finding a justification for that. And in this case, virtue ethics and deontology becomes a little alienating because it takes us out of how we do treat each other, and it says, no, this is how you ought to treat each other because of some appeal to what something is good for. Maybe we could say that this, to sell this and to propagate it as a commodity is immoral. This should be propagated as an eraser. You should erase with it. That's what it's good for. No, can we really say with a straight face that it is immoral to trade this eraser with someone because I need the money? Or because it's a business practice or whatever? No, I don't think so. And I think most of my viewers would probably agree that just because something is good for something, because it is useful for something, does not mean that we ought to act that way. So I hope this has given you some things to consider about, some ways that you can orient yourself ethically and figure out, why is it that I act the way I do? Why is it that I consider such and such thing an immoral action? And it is very much the case that you will find things from rights-based, duty-based, and goal-based ethics all slightly convincing in certain areas. Maybe you like the emphasis on freedom of libertarian ethics, but you think it fails to, treat people how we ought to be treated. So maybe you like virtue ethics for that reason. But maybe sometimes you don't like the arbitrariness of virtue ethics, so you like utilitarianism because it's a little bit more calculated. All of these things might be a little appealing in different ways, and that's how you know you are being a good thinker. If you cannot find a single thing about libertarian ethics that is appealing or that explains some of your actions, I think you're being dogmatic. In fact, a little of all of this is present in the way that we situate our actions. In terms of our legal systems, libertarianism is probably the foundation, at least in the US, of how we have our, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And freedom is the number one word that probably comes to mind when you think of the US, whether or not you're in it or not. And that's because libertarianism is something that really undergirds our way of thinking. But, so does Utilitarianism. If there is one patient who's dying and has 5 separate good organs, and there are 5 sick patients, all of which need one of those organs, it's like, okay, maybe if this guy's about to die, we might be able to justify giving him a happy, peaceful death and speeding up the process such that we can give those organs to 5 people that need it. And we have assisted in the ending of one life to help 5 lives thrive for hopefully a long time. Maybe you think a little bit of that is good too. But maybe you also think, there are certain modest ways of speaking and dressing and acting, and these can be accounted for by virtue ethics or deontology. All of these are important in a sense. And there are a lot more critical things which I've tried to steer away from, but which have nevertheless slipped in, which are meta-ethical concerns. Why ought we create a society where good habits are our end? Why ought we be oriented towards the telos of something? Why ought we value human well-being? Why ought we value the greatest good for the greatest number, like I said earlier? And I'm going to hopefully be doing another series where we will be looking, I've already did one on the Euthyphro dilemma, but I'll probably also do one on Hume and Sartre's ethics. So I hope this has been interesting and given you some stuff to think about, and I'll see you in another lecture.